dynamic of Russians using artillery as much as they do today, it will decrease to approximately 10, maybe 5,000 shells a day. Currently, it's between 10 and 20,000 shells a day. I believe next year it will be much, much less than that. So we should concentrate on destroying the Russian military infrastructure more, and I believe that this is something that we will see in the next year. Because we have to strike Russian air bases. Again, they use a lot of long-range missiles launched by the strategic aviation. We still had no chance to deal with this threat, but approximately next winter, next year, I believe that we will have capability to deal with that as well.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Operator Starsky, a Ukrainian veteran, YouTuber and co-founder of the Propaganda Study Institute. Operator Starsky, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you so much. The pleasure is mine.
To begin with, I wanted to get your sense of where you think we are now in this war. It feels like we've had a really significant few weeks, first with the US election result, then with the approval of the ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles for use inside Russia, and also with this ramping up of rhetoric by Vladimir Putin and the changes to his nuclear doctrine. So how do you view the phase of the war we're now in?
I see maybe not proper, but still response to Russian terrorism, to Russian threats, including nuclear threats. And this is something that we were talking about probably even last year, because a lot of people were, I would say, discouraged with the fact that we don't have this and that weaponry, we don't have like long-range missiles. Then we acquired ATACMS, then we acquired green light to use them. So that's exactly what I was saying back in 2023, that we will keep receiving improved military aid gradually. That is exactly what we see nowadays. Like F-16s, nobody could believe back in the days that we would have those airplanes. Now we operate those airplanes. We use them mainly to intercept Russian drones and missiles, but we do use them. That very fancy and expensive Russian drone was also intercepted by F-16, basically. So what we see now is that Putin keeps escalating, and Putin keeps threatening civilized world with nukes, with ballistic missiles. We can basically see that the World War III is already happening in Ukraine, because it's not just war of Russia against Ukraine, it's war of Russia and North Korea and Iran against Ukraine, which basically at this point protects the civilized world with its help. Another interesting thing was this recent Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, where a new resolution was adopted to keep supporting Ukraine so we could defend our country and our existence, and also keep providing Ukraine with different weapons and other measures that possibly may include things like Tomahawks. I believe that after this resolution was adopted, such chance is possible for Ukrainians. So we will see maybe preemptive strikes also happening against Russian launch sites and Russian missile systems, because as the Dutch representative said, Dutch chief of the military committee of NATO, he said that it's much more effective to strike Russian missile systems preemptively before they are utilized against Ukrainian cities. And another development that I personally see is that NATO countries keep preparing for possible Russian invasion that may happen within next 10-15 years. According to the chief of Czech intelligence, if Ukraine signs peace with inconvenient conditions, for example, like agreeing to give up its territories, which, by the way, by Russians will be accepted as, glorious victory of Russia over the evil NATO. or the conflict will be frozen in some other way, then Russia will spend 10, 15 years trying to refurbish its army because they lost a lot of tanks and vehicles and people, of course, and they will have to produce new weapons. And eventually we will see another aggression against Eastern Europe. Also, last month, the German chief of intelligence also warned that Russia may try to stockpile enough ammunition and enough weaponry to invade Europe already by the end of the decade. So I can see that Europeans are preparing. I can see that there are already cases of authorities telling people what to do in case of emergencies. That is basically something I did in 2021 on my Ukrainian YouTube channel, when I tried to explain Ukrainians what to do in case, of emergency, what to have in your emergency backpack and things like that. But in this case, Europeans are much more, I would say, calm or confident, because in my case, Ukrainians were writing in commentaries that I was escalating, I was, scaring people, and only next year the Russian invasion happened. Currently in Europe, I can see that Europeans are much more confident, apparently because they realize that Putin's terrorism, Russian aggression is not something you can play with. You gotta be prepared, and you gotta be confident, and you should also stay united.
Well, it's interesting you use the language of World War III, and there certainly is this sense that things are escalating into a kind of global conflict between, obviously Ukraine and Russia, but it takes on a wider global significance. Putin is using that language. Even Ukraine's allies, such as the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, is using that language. And you mentioned the support that Russia's been receiving from Iran and from North Korea. Apparently now some Houthi troops from Yemen are also fighting on behalf of Russia. I wonder what you see the significance of that now being, and particularly now we have Donald Trump re-elected as US president. Do you think that will mean he will push for a kind of negotiated settlement in his first few weeks in office? There has been talk of maybe a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine. I don't know how you feel about that, or even some kind of freezing of the front lines. How would you feel about that?
I think that Donald Trump will obviously try to stop the conflict as soon as possible, according to his opinion, according to his thoughts, observations that he has. But it will not really be possible. First of all, the demilitarized zone must be patrolled by the UN peacekeepers. And this is completely impossible because otherwise they would be there already back in 2022. Unfortunately, Russia is a permanent member of UNSC. That is why we will never see that happening. Russians don't want peacekeepers in Ukraine. They don't want this conflict to stop. They didn't start the war to stop the war. It's crazy. They didn't start the invasion in Ukraine because they wanted peace. If you want peace, you don't go to a different country killing people. That is not how peace works. Unfortunately, a lot of people were brainwashed into believing, the opposite. Another thing is Trump will definitely understand, he will come to this understanding that agreements with Putin cannot be reached, or they will not be respected by Putin, because Putin already violated plenty of treaties. He violated Budapest Memorandum. He violated the territorial agreement signed by Putin himself with Ukrainian President Kuchma in 2003, recognizing Crimea and Donbass and all the borders of Ukraine as Ukrainian territory. And he mentioned this himself several times in 2007, back in those days. And of course, he violated that Minsk agreements that were also violated numerous times, even though there is such misunderstanding among people who believe that it's Ukraine, the one that violated Minsk agreements. At the same time, Debaltseve that Russians captured back in 2014 in winter, according to Minsk agreement, it was supposed to be returned under Ukrainian control, which never happened. According to Minsk agreements, Russians were not supposed to build new positions like they did during our deployment, for example, in Zaitsev, in Travneva, on the Svitlodarsk Bulge, where they would dig closer and closer and trying to capture our positions and shelling us every day. And I lost my friends from my brigade due to the Russian fire that was not supposed to happen due to the Minsk, according to the Minsk agreements. But I lost friends, by the way, during the days when Trump was president. So one thing that I'm sure will happen is that eventually he will understand that it's impossible to have any agreements with Putin because he doesn't respect that. He has his own global strategy that he will try to, the objectives that he will try to achieve no matter what. And eventually, I think Trump and his administration will come to understanding that they have to arm Ukraine with everything we need. And most probably that is something that will happen. I'm not really sure how it correlates with the idea of American isolationism, because if you want to preserve peace in some area, you have to have your country, your military power represented there somehow. If there's nobody there, then like you don't have any influence in that region anyways. So I believe that it will end with Donald Trump supporting Ukraine anyways. On the other hand, though, of course, other situation may happen, and his administration can decide that probably it's not worth it because Ukraine is far away on the other part of the globe, and we can just withdraw all the support and everything else. But in this case, we still have Europe. We have European allies. Currently, it was mentioned that daily support for Ukraine cost a European like 1.5 cups of coffee. Literally, after the war is finished, I will give out coffee to all the guests coming to Ukraine personally. I don't care. But people must also remember that European Union, members of NATO within Europe, make roughly 50% of the whole annual GDP of NATO countries. That is approximately $40 trillion a year, and roughly half of that is the contribution of European NATO members. Therefore, if it's 3 cups of coffee a day instead of 1.5, does it make big difference? Because unlike in Russia, Europeans can afford that. Unlike in Russia, Europeans have future and good good environment, good roads, good everything, comparing to what we see in terrorist federation when 2/3 of population don't have in-house toilets. On the other hand, we can see that North Korea, for example, is expanding its military production. There was information, I think it emerged only yesterday, that North Koreans escalate the production of long-range missiles for Russians. And again, people must ask themselves, why does Russia buy weaponry in North Korea, in Iran? Aren't they able to produce it themselves? And that is a good question, because people who believe that Russia is almighty, that it's like it has indestructible military and things like that, they must ask themselves, if it is so, then why Russia so badly needs help from such countries as Iran and North Korea, Syria, Yemen, African countries, Colombia, Venezuela, to destroy this weak, losing Ukraine? That is a good question that I hope that everybody will ask themselves.
Well, that's a very good point. And I wanted to ask you actually about some of the logistical and supply problems that Russia have at the moment, because Yes, it is true that Russia is worryingly making some gains still, particularly at the moment in the west of Donetsk Oblast. But if you kind of scratch beneath the surface, we know they've got serious manpower problems. We've talked about the casualty rate for some time, and that's why they're taking soldiers from the Houthis and from North Korea and from other places. But also from an equipment point of view, I mean, according to the Institute for the Study of War, in their most recent update, Russian command posts are now relying on Chinese-made radios for internal communications because Russia cannot domestically produce enough quality radios for the Russian military. So I suppose there is this kind of sense at the moment that just as the talk about some negotiated settlement is kind of amping up, there is actually a fundamental weakness being exposed in Russia, which, if you're a Ukraine supporter who wants to see Putin thoroughly defeated, must be frustrating because you think, look, if we can stick this out, Russia can't last that much longer.
Absolutely. And I believe that one of the best ways to destroy the Russian threat, the threat of Russian terrorism, it's not through military, it's through economics. Because if the world manages to choke Russia economically and isolate it and literally cancel it on the international market, then Russia is absolutely powerless and useless. They will not be able to continue their aggression, and we will forget about this threat, at least for a while. Regarding radios, by the way, this is true, and this is something that we noticed even back in the days in 2022. They already had the problem that they lacked radio stations for their personnel. They used those Chinese Baofeng radio stations that we used in 2017 to scan and intercept their communications in between the hybrid terrorist groups. So that is exactly the case. In our case, it's of course different. My brigade, for example, was equipped with Harris stations like back in 2017, and they were extremely, extremely advanced comparing to other stations like Motorola's, for example. We already had it back then, and we were trying to use that equipment. It's extremely good comparing to what Russians have. It's extremely good. But, if you really want to understand if Russia has problems with their equipment, you gotta check out those videos where Russians ride like golf carts and motorcycles into the battle. The recent video I saw, and it literally cracked me up so bad, was when Russians drove like Zhiguli, like this old Lada machine, into attack. And then this Lada had to return really fast because attack failed, obviously. But another thing, like the other side of this is that Ukraine has a lot of support that is basically proved by the fact that we have all kinds of cars. We have hundreds of trucks delivered to Ukrainians by different volunteers, Car for Ukraine, NAFO, and other extremely decent people. And looking at what happens in Ukraine, anybody can understand that this war is extremely black and white. It's extremely clear. You can extremely clearly see what side is basically terrorists, despised by the rest of the world, and which side is supported by the rest of the world. By the developed countries, you can see that Ukrainians have plenty of support, not just from governments, from approximately 50 countries that support Ukraine in terms of military, in terms of military supplies, but also by people from all around the world, not only Europe, not only United States, but also South Korea, also Japan, Thailand, and other countries, Australia, of course, New Zealand. You can see that this war is something very, very clear. And of course, it takes Russians a lot of resources to brainwash people and convince them that, no, in fact, Russia was, just defending itself. That's why they invaded Ukraine.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. And I found it very interesting that you said earlier on that you do think Donald Trump, sooner or later, will absolutely come down on the side of Ukraine. Do you think the best way of persuading the Trump administration to issue that support, hopefully sooner than later, is actually to use this argument about how this is becoming a global conflict? Because, yes, there are people in the Trump administration who are less hostile to Russia than in the current Biden administration, but there are a lot of people who are very anti-Iran and making the argument that, look, you can't be pro-Russia and anti-Iran because they're basically on the same side. And by making that argument, maybe that's the way of persuading Donald Trump and those around him to commit to supporting Ukraine.
I believe that it will happen just the way it happened in Ukraine. Okay, because, for example, if we take Ukrainian election in 2019, Zelensky was also accused and blamed a lot that he doesn't understand the situation. He was blamed by his opponents, for example, that he was we can call it like pro-Russian, because back in the days, Zelensky had concerts in like Kremlin for Russian oligarchs, etc., etc. And he was also Russian speaking. And the first thing he did when he became a president was he started this de-escalation campaign by literally telling Ukrainian soldiers not to shoot back. And Ukrainian soldiers were not allowed to shoot back. There were like all kinds of measures made to make sure that Ukrainians move back their artillery and, let's say, heavy equipment, and they will not shoot back under any circumstance. And what we saw as a result, Russians made their positions closer to our positions. They attempted to storm several places, again, like Zaitsevo. I remember our deployment, they made attempt to capture our position. We had like very first hand-to-hand combat with Russian terrorists in years on that very position. It was Zaitsevo, 2019 or 2020. And eventually, what Zelensky says now, and he says that in basically every speech, is that you cannot make agreements with Putin. Putin doesn't respect your agreements. Putin will fool you. He will do all he can in order to reach his goals, his objectives. He doesn't respect you as a partner. He doesn't respect you at all. Therefore, he will never keep his word. He will always violate any agreement you make with him, except if you are like Iran or North Korea. If you are a terrorist regime that can cooperate with Russia, then of course you can count on having some respect. But other than that, he will never cooperate with Western world, because West and Russia, they are different worlds that have absolutely nothing in common.
And just finally, we've obviously spoken today a lot about the politics of the war at the moment. I wonder if we just focus on what's happening on the ground, what do you see as the likely Ukrainian objectives over the winter? You know, we're seeing Russia make advances, incremental advances, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, in the west of Donetsk Oblast. We've obviously got Ukraine still occupying much of Kursk Oblast. What do you see as being the military objectives for Ukraine over the coming months?
Over the upcoming month, I see several objectives, such as improving our defense, improving our positions, especially in the direction of Pokrovsk and Kurakhova. Russians are contributing a lot of their personnel, their manpower, a lot of their vehicles, remaining tanks, in order to take as much area towards Pokrovsk and Kurakhova as possible. That is what we see nowadays. Recently, they even destroyed the civilian power plant, heating power plant in Kurakhova, literally to banish as many civilians as possible from the area, because civilians are facing the upcoming winter, and now they don't have neither heating nor electricity. And what I see, Ukrainian main objective will most probably be to keep those main directions of the Russian offensive defended as much as possible. But I believe that another part of our strategy will be to strike Russian logistics in the Russian rear on the Russian territory, because there are approximately 200 high priority targets already designated by the General Staff that can and should be destroyed. That will dramatically change the outcome of this year and beginning of the next year, because for example, one of the first cases of using long-range weapons and our HIMARS systems against Russian ammo storages, we saw it happened in Bryansk region. That the arsenal that was built there by Russians, it was some of the biggest in the area, and it was feeding their troops in the Kursk Oblast, feeding DPRK troops. And the results were, I would say, immediate, because Russians say that themselves, that they also lack shells on the front line. I think by the middle of the next year, the dynamic of Russians using artillery as much as they do today, it will decrease to approximately 10, maybe 5,000 shells a day. Currently, it's between 10 and 20,000 shells a day. I believe next year it will be much, much less than that. So we should concentrate on destroying the Russian military infrastructure more, and I believe that this is something that we will see in the next year, because we have to strike Russian air bases. Again, they use a lot of long-range missiles launched by the strategic aviation. We still had no chance to deal with this threat, but approximately next winter, next year, I believe that we will have capability to deal with that as well. So this is something that I personally expect from the next year, from winter, spring, that we will be able to hit crucial and critical Russian objects on the Russian territory, military factories, facilities producing shells, and equipment for their aviation and tanks and armored vehicles.
Operator Starsky, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.